So next up, for pieces of pottery that were submitted for the Pottery Throwdown Challenge, is a piece of pottery that was submitted by Shaylee Kelly. So this pot was reportedly made January 9th of 2009. So it's a few years old now. Shaylee says this would be a good pot for decoration or for storing something like tall spatulas, whisks, and other kitchen tools. So for those of you who like to keep something on the counter, ready and handy instead of in a drawer, this sounds like it'd be a great pot for that. Might also be just a nice flower vase for a floral arrangement. So anyway, thanks Shaylee for submitting it. Here we go. So I'm working today with WS5. I've got roughly 6 pounds of clay on the wheel. I've got it stuck to the bat. As I go through the coning and centering process, squeeze this in a little bit to create a conical or cone shape. And then center it back down. So because I know that my piece is going to be fairly tall, as I work through the coning and centering process, I don't want to make anything that's going to be really short. Okay, I want to keep it smaller in diameter and a little bit taller. So I'm just working with that coning and centering process to keep the base a little smaller in diameter, and I don't have to push it in later on. And I'm all doing this based on what I can see in the picture that was submitted by Shaylee. So once I'm happy with the shape of the piece of clay that I have in front of me, and I go ahead and I'm going to use my needle tool and I'm going to make a target. Alright, that target just serves as a place where I can look at to place my hands. So most oftentimes for holing out, which is the next step here in the process, I like to use my left hand. I use my ring finger and my middle finger of my left hand, because I can create a nice straight hole right down the middle of my piece of clay. And I can set that to the right depth that I want it to be for the pot that I'm making. So once I've got it to that depth, and by experience, I know that depth is suitable. You don't want to go too deep. Okay? It's okay to leave the bottom of your pot a little thicker because you're trimming. But if you go too deep and make the base of the pot too thin, well then at some point you're going to have a really thin spot and the bottom of that pot is going to be too thin. It's going to become more fragile, and you're going to have the potential for breakage later on. So once I've set my depth, called holing it out, then I move to the next step, which is opening. So I'm using those same two fingers, okay, my left hand on the inside, right hand on the outside, and I'm using those same fingers and I'm kind of squeezing, making a big clamp. And I'm moving the clay outward towards that outer wall So to thin out the wall and make it so that I can pull the clay upwards and make the wall taller. When you make a pinch pot, you're basically doing exactly the same thing. Just you're doing it by hand. You're using your thumb and your fingers and you're pinching at the bottom. And then as you work your way up, the pinch goes up, 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 and your wall gets thinner. So if you like making pinch pots and you like that technique, well, then you're really going to like when you get to work at the wheel, because this process, basically now you're making a wheel thrown pinch pot, sort of. Not quite like that, but all right. So I'm going to slow this down a little bit more because now I want to get ready to do some pulling. So using my right hand on the outside and my sponge as a guide because it's got moisture. My left hand is just there to make sure that the clay moves upward like I need it to. When I work with small pieces of clay, I just use my fingers. When I work with larger pieces of clay, I'll incorporate my sponge. Okay, that was a pretty good pull. Straighten out my wall a little bit. There we go. So I'm going to bring this. I'm going to use a little technique called collaring. And with my hands nice and wet, I have my thumbs together on my side. My thumbs are together, and I'm gently squeezing inward. My thumbs are together. I'm gently squeezing inward and moving upward. And eventually, as I do that, you'll see on your side, my fingers are actually touching. I move slowly and steadily, slightly inward, but upward. Hey, we're getting a little taller there. There we go. Okay, so I still have clay that I can pull upward. So if we truly think of our pot as being functional or utilitarian, I want to make sure I have a preference when I do this is to leave my wall a little bit thicker. I want my pot to be a little more durable. The thinner you make it, the more fragile and delicate it becomes. So when I do this kind of stuff, if I'm thinking of a flower vase or something utilitarian that would hold your spatulas and your wooden spoons and your whisks, your kitchen tools, and I want to make sure that I have something that's going to be strong enough to hold all of that. So I'm good with my height. My height on this pot is about 10 inches. So the thickness of the wall is good. So now I'm going to start thinking about shape. So as I look at the picture, this piece has a little bit, it's narrower at the bottom. It gradually comes outward in the middle to create the belly, and then it comes back in to create the neckline. All right, so that's what we're going to work on. So gently, what I have to be able to do is I've got to be able to hold the clay at the bottom so that it doesn't come totally out further than I want it to be. But if I do so from the inside slowly and gently, I can do that just with my hand. So my inside hand is wet. Working from the bottom. You see that I'm creating that outward shape. I'm going to go back and even that out a little bit. So remember here I talked about collaring, just to kind of straighten that back up again. All right, here I'm going to go back and I'm going to use one of my ribs. So I've got a green rib that's got a nice straight edge on it. I want to be able to get that kind of on the outside here. And that's going to clean and help define the shape, the outer shape of my pot. So now, that shape at the rim, I'm satisfied with my outer shape, but what I also want to do is I want to bring this and round it off. So I've turned my rib over, and I'm now using a curved side of my rib So that little tool I used at the rib, just to give it a little bit of rounded area, it's just a plastic tie off of a bread bag. And that helped me compress the rim a little bit. That's all that was. So I'm pretty satisfied with the shape and the overall form. I'm going to make sure that before I call it a day, I'm going to mop up the water from the inside. I don't want to leave any standing water on the inside. That would be a bad thing. I want my clay to dry out evenly, uniformly, so that it doesn't crack. And that in a few days this will be ready for bisque firing. So you see what I had was about 10 inches and now it's right at about 9 or a little bit under. So because I made it wider, it actually got shorter. So if you look at that piece, okay, and hopefully that's somewhat of a reflection of what you see there. So that in a nutshell, Shaylee, is how I made that pot. Thanks for submitting.